This is one of my big beefs with the neocons. You're either Chamberlain or you're Churchill. And there is no sort of in-between ground, and everything is a black and white decision. Everything is Munich.
This week, I sit down with Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, talking to me about a libertarian foreign policy for the United States and his personal relationship with President Donald Trump. I'll get to questions that you have from social media on the big summit coming up between Trump and Putin in Helsinki, and then puppet regime, which I'm not going to try to describe. Just watch it for yourself and understand it is Crazy Donnie with his view of tariffs and trade. But first, a message from the people who help us keep the lights on. First, your world this week. And I'd like to start with just a moment on what the GZERO actually is. Because the United States today does not want to be the global policeman, doesn't want to be the global architect of trade, doesn't want to be the cheerleader or even the spokesman of human rights and global values. But if the United States isn't doing it, no one else is going to. We saw that with the failed G7 summit just a month ago that ended in chaos. None of the Europeans are capable of providing any of those roles themselves or as a group. And the Chinese, the world's second largest economy, they certainly are an economic superpower, but they're not a military superpower. They don't have the diplomatic capabilities, and they're not preparing either to create a new world order, at least today, or one that would supplant the role of the United States in the old one, which means we're in between. It's a geopolitical recession. It's an unprecedented time of volatility and uncertainty where alliances are in flux, where institutions are open to question, and where our very values, what we stand for, is something we have to scratch our heads about. That's the GZERO, and you're gonna see it on display very soon at the Putin-Trump Summit. The most historic meeting that Trump has had as president was, of course, with Kim Jong-un from North Korea. The most important was with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago. But the one everyone is paying attention to is the much-awaited sit-down between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. They're going to have a one-on-one, unmonitored at the beginning, which nobody wants to happen because who knows what Trump is going to say. And why is it that he likes Putin so much anyway? Is it just because he's a strong man? Is it because everyone tells him that he can't and because Obama didn't like him very much? Or maybe is it something we don't know about with the investigations? We're not going to answer that question here. We do know these men have been looking forward to seeing each other for a very long time. Ever since that second sit-down they didn't want to talk about at the dinner at the G20 in Germany a year ago, when they spent almost an hour together at a dinner that otherwise Trump found very, very boring. I think the meeting will go perfectly well. Why? Because they wanted to, and also because there's lots to talk about. On arms control, maybe you get negotiations moving. On Syria, Trump wants out, doesn't have a problem with Bashar Assad. That sounds good to Putin. On things like Crimea, Trump has already said, hey, that's old news. Why don't we just recognize it? He may well do that directly with Putin, wouldn't surprise me. The point is that no matter what he says, he's incredibly constrained by his own advisors, by Congress, by the media, by the investigations. And so the underlying US-Russia relationship has right now about as bad as it's been since the Andropov era, decades ago. And no matter how much Putin and Trump want to improve that, it's probably only going to move very marginally. In 3-6 months' time, the headlines will go away. We're still going to be stuck with a US-Russia relationship that feels colder than Cold War. That's enough for me. Let's go to you and your office hours.
Which European leaders will be the most anxious about the outcome of the Trump-Putin summit?
The Germans are very anxious because Trump and Putin together are going to undermine their idea of Western values, right? So you're not going to have support for Germany's policy on Syria. You're not going to have support for Germany's policy on Ukraine. That worries Angela Merkel, but also Theresa May, who now has had a British citizen die of a Russian nerve agent on their territory. She and her government believes that's all about Putin. Trump doesn't even want to talk about it. She's anxious too.
Which country, apart from America or Russia, stands to gain the most from a successful Trump-Putin summit?
I'd say it's not one, it's all those countries in between that are supporting illiberalism, that like the idea of Merkel and Macron being on the back foot. So it's Hungary and Prime Minister Orban, it's Italy and their new coalition anti-establishment government, and it's a number of the East Europeans that are sort of simpatico with that perspective. This week I sit down with Kentucky physician turned Senator Rand Paul. The staunch libertarian has pulled few punches during his tenure in office, but he's also developed a surprisingly close relationship with President Trump. Today I'll ask him about what a libertarian foreign policy looks like. But I started off with a question about a certain summit coming up between President Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
Now, you have been interestingly supportive of the Trump-Putin summit. Something a lot of people seem to be uncomfortable with given all the challenges that Trump has around Putin.
Right.
Do those challenges not worry you, or do you think the engagement is so important that it doesn't matter?
I've seen no evidence that somehow, President Trump is connected to the Russians and somehow being manipulated by Russians. No evidence of that. When I ask him about it, he says he's never talked to any of them. During the campaign, he didn't have any conversation with any Russians. And I think he gets mad from a pride point of view when people are trying to point out he didn't win the election. Somehow it was illegitimate and that the Russians somehow won the election. You can see how that would make anybody who's a proud person mad. But I love seeing him down in West Virginia where he gets like 75% of the vote and he's got 30,000 people there and he says, how many Russians do we have out there? And I asked the same question in my state. Anybody here ever talked to a Russian or been manipulated by a Russian? Most of Russia's ads that we've seen, like that were on Facebook and stuff, are written in such bad English, nobody would even read them probably. They weren't really that well done. Should we try to stop Russia from participating in our elections? Yes. Should we try to prevent? But that's sort of a cybersecurity question more than a political question. And I think the whole Russia investigation has become really just a politicized thing at this point.
You're one of the people out there that seems to have developed one of those workable relationships and conversations ongoing with the president. Now, you look at allies around the world who seem to have a much harder time with that, heads of state.
Right.
You have any advice for them on what they should be doing better? Like Merkel, Angela Merkel, how might she develop a more functional relationship with the president, which she clearly does not have right now?
I think people who tend to want to shade over who they are and are not direct have a more difficult time. There's also in his discussions, and particularly his pronouncements, there is a degree of bombast on occasion and nationalist pride. And I think that's done for effect. He wants to make sure he's being heard from and that we're a big, loud voice. And often I've disagreed with it, but then sometimes I've sort of looked back and said, well, maybe it worked. I mean, for example, on North Korea, I was worried about the rhetoric. I thought it was too bombastic and too much, John Bolton, let's go to war kind of stuff. And war's a real disaster over there. Millions of people would die in a war. And I worried about that rhetoric. And then even the president sort of indicated that some of that rhetoric was to make sure he knew we were serious. And if you're using it, I guess I think back to like Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick. I think Trump is speak loudly, carry a big stick, but then also be willing to compromise at some point. You have to set up, and you can see this as a negotiating tool. If I want something from you, I have to either have something really good you want, or I have to show some strength that there's going to be adverse repercussions.
I was very interested in your initial opposition to Pompeo's nomination as Secretary of State, which you shifted on after private conversations with him. What was he able to say to you that actually made you comfortable that you were going to go ahead with this? Because you were pretty decisive in that conversation.
I think we've been at war too long in too many places, and I've said it over and over again. I agree with President Trump that the Iraq War was a mistake. And people say, and this is what Secretary Pompeo said to me as a nominee, he says, it's just ancient history. And I said, the reason it's not ancient history is that it's the maybe worst policy decision we made in the last 20 or 30 years. And it is an example of similar policy decisions that may yet be made. So does regime change work? Are we greeted as liberators and is everything perfect and the Middle East more stable since the Iraq War? I'd say all of that's wrong. I think Iran has been emboldened, and the people who worry about Iran worry more now that Iraq is no longer there to counterbalance them, and Iraq is essentially more allied with Iran than us, probably.
Definitely.
And so I think that I kept asking that question to Secretary Pompeo, was the Iraq War a mistake? And we never quite got there, but I also had conversations with the president as well, and I was assured by both that he did acknowledge that we had made mistakes in the Middle East, and I also think I'd made my point at that point. Some people criticized me on the left and the right. Everybody criticized me, I think, for it, but for finally voting for him. But I did it mainly because of consideration of the president. And I voted for other secretaries of state that wasn't particularly pleased with, John Kerry being one. And some on my side were like, well, if you can vote for John Kerry, why can't you vote for Mike Pompeo? So there's a certain amount of letting the president choose his person. But also, I think there was enough attention drawn to my part of this that I think I was able to make that statement over and over and over again, that we've been at war too long in too many places. I also got Pompeo to admit in writing that there is no military solution to Afghanistan. Interestingly, the Obama administration said that in 2010. You know, it was either before or about the same time that they sent 100,000 more troops over there.
Yeah.
So we've been almost 8 years where everybody, right, left, middle, is saying there's no military solution.
Yeah.
So Pompeo's on the right, more hawkish, wants to stay in more places, and yet he's saying there's no military solution. It's like the next obvious question is, why are you sending more troops there? And I've asked the president that question directly. I mean, the president really says he's not for being there. You know, he'd like to come home
So
from
have they
Afghanistan.
told you they're planning to wind that war down?
Well, I think what I got from them is the general, which I always get when I talk to the president. When I talk to President Trump, I feel that he and I are very much on the same wavelength as far as not being for another major wars in the Middle East, for trying to look at problems we have here at home, to not spend so many resources in Afghanistan and bring them home. I'm just a little quicker to getting to the point of that. I would come home. I know there are problems if we come home, but there are problems if we stay, and they're bleeding us dry over there, $50 billion a year. I think the president will come home at some point in time, and I think they're probably open to allowing some negotiation. I asked Secretary Mattis this in our lunch not too long ago. I said, is there any conception of the war ending in Afghanistan without a negotiation with the Taliban? And his answer was no. Or I may have formed it the other way. Will we eventually negotiate with the Taliban? Yes. It was a very simple answer. And the reason I asked it in my conference is that, once again, we have some very naive neocons who believe no, Afghan will end with unconditional surrender. You know, they will all march in and then they will become a colony of the United States and do what we tell them. It's never going to end that way. And most wars don't end with unconditional surrender. And this is one of my big beefs with the neocons. You're either Chamberlain or you're Churchill. And there is no sort of in-between ground, and everything is a black and white decision. Everything is Munich.
So, Senator, you want to engage a lot around the world. And on North Korea, so far at least, you've been giving President Trump reasonably high marks. Tell me why we should be optimistic here.
You know, I think President Trump's different than almost any president we've ever had. I think I'm safe in saying that.
Fair point.
I think a lot of other presidents in the past have maybe over-litigated things. That, you know, if you want to get to a conclusion, denuclearization, they're like, oh, we're only going to start the negotiation with the conclusion. And same way with Iran. You know, you can't have an agreement until we start with a conclusion. I think it's unrealistic to start with a conclusion, although they are, in this sense, maybe starting with a conclusion. Kim did agree to denuclearization. I think, though, the proof...
In principle, yeah.
Right, the proof's sort of in the pudding. I mean, you have to see it actually happening. But I think Trump was bold in taking the meeting. He's being criticized by some on the right and the left for saying, oh, you're legitimizing someone with a terrible human rights record. And yet, we don't really worry so much about trying to have treaties with, you know, England or people that have great human rights records. It's easy. But we really don't have so much dispute with England. We have dispute with countries that often don't have good human rights records. So, and there has to be a beginning. And I think there might have been a time when I was younger, I would say, oh, no, we shouldn't negotiate with the Chinese or something because of their human rights record. And yet I think overall it's been a great advance for us to have had better relations, since the 70s, since Nixon and Kissinger went there.
So you're mellowing a little bit.
Yeah, maybe so, maybe so. And, and I think there still can be subtly over time the hope that things do get better. I think when you have more trade, when you have more freedom of commerce, I think inevitably that political rights and human rights do improve. People say, oh, things aren't perfect in China. And I say, well, how were they under Mao? I'm thinking that it's a lot better probably in China. They still don't have the freedom we have, but they have to choose that at some point. Their people have to choose that. It's going to be the same for North Korea. They have almost no freedom, but hopefully trade and commerce, if we can get there, will be helpful.
So, you've criticized neocons for being all or nothing in so many of these disputes,
Right.
Hiroshima or it's a peace deal.
Right.
Can we see progress before denuclearization? In other words, Pompeo is basically saying no sanctions can be removed until actually we have this done.
Well, I'd say we already have seen progress. It's amazing to me that we've had them already say that they're not going to do nuclear testing. That's a step forward by anybody's estimation. And that we've said we won't do war games. And it's amazing, and this is why this is underappreciated. If you go around and you talk to the Senate Republican caucus, they're like, oh, we must have war games. We cannot be without war games. They're not willing to give that up at all until the very end. And so Trump gave that up in the beginning, but it can be restarted anytime. I think it's gestures like that show your commitment. He's also talked about even reducing troops at some point in time. And I think he'll make that contingent on compliance and probably a period of time. And really the same with sanctions. So I don't think sanctions are going to be released in the very beginning. But I think sanctions, and I think their complaint about the Iran agreement is they were released too easily. But I would say that if it's going to take time for them to denuclearize, or if they're willing to, let's say they have 40 and they're willing to dismantle 10 of them, there might be something you can give for that, and there might be something you could give for 10 more nuclear weapons, et cetera, until you get to the point.
But some back and forth, even on the economic side, over the course of these negotiations, you think is potentially a reasonable way through?
Like with sanctions, you mean whether some lessening? I think it's going to have to, I don't think any sanctions will be released until there's something verifiable that's been done on their part.
On the ground.
Stopping the testing is a great first step, and almost really the equivalence of stopping games. Maybe not quite, but they
If they
sound
did something
fairly equal.
verifiable on ICBMs, for example, would you say, we should give them something economically?
I'm all for giving a little bit for everything we get and doing it gradually over time. I don't think it should be all or none, and I don't think we should give up all the sanctions in the beginning. But little baby steps. We've gone through and we've had a big success. But it's a big step for North Korea to actually say they really are going to get rid of their weapons. Now, the one thing I wouldn't do is what we did the last time. We gave them money. I'm not for giving them any money. I think we should give them the allure of trade. Money is dissipated quickly anyway, usually goes to the wrong people, would go to the regime, whereas trade's going to go to entrepreneurs and people who sell stuff that people want. And trade has the potential with South Korea and with Japan and China and Russia. The growth of trade, really, you could see North Korea becoming what East Germany, became when it became part of Germany. And I know they don't want unification, and yet trade sort of unifies you in a way.
The right has been quite different from you on Iran, where you were not in favor of ripping up this Iranian deal.
Right.
How did that conversation go between you and the president?
I haven't been able to sort of get through to the president on that. He was very emphatic from the very beginning that he was going to tear it up. When I was in the debates with him, I said it was a bad idea. It wasn't a perfect deal. No deal is perfect. And even with the Iran deal, I would have preferred that the sanctions and the money came up. We give them their money, but give it slower, and the sanctions come off slower, and we have verifiable sort of progress. But really, most people think that they have complied with it. And I think we've mixed apples and oranges with the whole Iran agreement, because they have abided to the nuclear agreement, but we did not have agreement on ballistic missiles.
There was not.
Yeah, and if that bothers people, I kept saying, let's have a new agreement in addition. But I do think this, and I say this all the time now. I said it to the White House today. I talked to high-ranking people at the White House. I said, if you want a better Iran agreement, one, it's not going to be easy because you got to go back and rebuild the whole nuclear agreement. And then if you want a ballistic missile agreement, you will never get it until you realize that it would have to include Saudi Arabia. Because really, this is a 1,000-year war. It's a religious war, and much of what Iran does there is supporting co-religionists around the Middle East, and so do the Saudis too as well. But unless you realize that what Iran does in developing ballistic missiles is in response to Saudi Arabia, and that Saudi Arabia and the 8 Gulf Sheikdoms or 14 Gulf Sheikdoms, they spend 8 times as much as Iran, and we just had a big deal with Saudi Arabia. So what does Iran feel like? They're pressured to develop more weapons, not less. So if you ever wanted an agreement over there, it would have to include Saudi Arabia ratcheting down and Iran. You know, when we had agreement with Russia, we both lowered weapons. You can't just say, this is what the neocons, I think, are naive. They think, oh, Iran, you shall do this. And it's like, short of unconditional surrender, they're just not giving up their ballistic missiles.
Made harder by the fact that Trump is seen as a very strong supporter of the Saudis.
I think so. And the big arms deal, I think, has made peace less likely over there. In fact, I would do the opposite. I would, even with the big arms deal, will, as a senator, try to stop it. I have the ability to get a privileged vote, which means nobody can stop me from at least getting the vote. And I've done this twice now. And one of the reasons to do it is to get the Saudis to behave and to act better in Yemen. I think the Saudis have acted less than admirably. You know, they've had a blockade. Food has been in short supply. 17 million people live on the edge of starvation in Yemen. Largest cholera epidemic in modern history in Yemen. 80% of the food comes in through the ports, and the Saudis have been blockading it, and we've been helping them. There's been no debate about whether we should be involved in that war. And so there is still a great deal of discussion in the Congress that I'm pushing and others that the Constitution intended that we would initiate war, which means we would debate it and we would be responsible to the voters every 2 years and every 6 years, but there would be, you know, we would have to explain to the voters while we're at war. Now,
no one in Congress really has been very interested in pushing that legislation.
Well, it depends. It depends. I mean, the last time on trying to limit Saudi weapon sales, I think we got 44 votes. So, I mean, it's not quite a majority. The first time, I think we got 22. So we have been building on this. And, you know, as the outrage, I think, increases over what's happening in Yemen and our role in it and the fact that we've never given the president permission to do this.
Well, when Trump ran, he was obviously much closer to you on most of these issues. And the very fact that he's willing to talk about, hey, why are these 32,000 troops in South Korea?
Right.
There are very few people in Washington willing to actually say that publicly.
That's
right?
what always encourages me.
Right. And you had the same thing with what Trump has been saying on Syria, what he's been saying on Afghanistan. And then you look at the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and you look at Secretary Mattis, and you also look, at least so far, what Pompeo's been saying publicly. To what extent do you believe that, irrespective of the president and you may be interested in, that ultimately we're going to continue to see the same sort of American footprint with the cost attached to that?
As you know, the status quo is, you know, the ball's rolling and it just kind of keeps rolling in that direction. There's been a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy here for a long, long time. And it's a bipartisan consensus to intervene everywhere all the time. It really is. And so the president is surrounded by many of those same voices. And I wish it weren't so. I don't have the power to change that. As you know, I didn't want John Bolton there. I think John Bolton is a terrible influence on the president.
You said he should be at the children's table in North Korea.
I just hope they're not listening to the things he has to say. I mean, you saw what he tried to say at the very beginning, before the negotiations with North Korea started.
You mean the Libya option?
Yeah, he said, oh yeah, we're going to use the Libyan model. And he was either incredibly tone deaf and was talking about the details of the treaty,
or he was trying to kill it.
Or he was trying to kill it because everybody knows the end of the Libyan model was where we kill the leader. They give up their nuclear weapons and we killed the leader. So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that every time I talk to the president, this includes if I talked to him today, which I didn't, but if I talked to him today, I would probably get the same impression, because I think it really is an honest and sincere point of view that he doesn't want more war. He wants less war. He thinks we get shafted and have to pay for all the wars. We pay for them in our lives as well. We're everywhere doing everybody's work for them. So he's always said that, and he still does. But it's the same with a lot of presidents. Presidents will say things, and then the status quo kind of bogs them down, and the fact that this whole town has always been on both sides for intervening in most places around the world.
Rand Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now puppet regime, which I'm still not going to explain, but you know you need more puppets.
Mr. Trump,
Some people say your policy ideas are trapped in the 1950s.
Fake news, Ian. As you know, I'm more of a 1980s New York kind of guy. It's Crazy Donnie's greatest deficit-crushing, China-busting, logic-defying tariff extravaganza. 10% on aluminum, 25% on flat-screen TV, steel and TV cameras, even dishwashers, 27.4%. Balloons, blimps, even satellites. Get it all, make it great, pay it now during Crazy Donnie's greatest tit-for-tat tariff event ever. Crazy Donnie, his trade policies are insane.
That's our show this week. If you like what you've seen, check us out on gzeromedia.com. Watch the show, listen to the podcast, internalize our message. Come back next week. We're going to Rome, the birthplace of modern civilization, and by far one of the most dysfunctional governments in the Western world you will find today. We talk to all of it. Come back next week.